It's like waiting for the Renaissance, you know, when everybody thinks that it has to happen. It's commonly said that every 10 years there's a big star and it's in the middle of the decade. Dick Clark said this in an interview I did once. He said, well, you know, there was Sinatra in the 40s and there was Elvis in the 50s and the Beatles in the 60s and now's the time, and that was 2 years ago, and nothing has happened.
Christ, where is the poet drunk? Where is the Lamar sky? Where is the poet punk?
Who was Lester Bangs?
He was a rebel, you know, he was a rebellious teenager.
One bright light was Lester Bangs, El Cajon kid.
He spent all those formative years here, and he took that with him wherever he went.
He could have been an A+ student all the way down the line if he'd wanted to apply himself.
He was a very sharp person. He was literary, he had knowledge, he was extraordinarily witty, he was very good looking at the time. He was into weirdos, he was interesting.
And you walked into Lester's room and it was like, what the heck is going on here, you know?
I mean, he died young in his early 30s, and much of his writing happened here in El Cajon.
It was all pretty wholesome for the most part, you know? I mean, we were the only ones who really looked for the darker and the riskier things.
Lester was our Moses.
He was the great gonzo journalist, the gutter poet, the romantic visionary of writing about rock and roll. He was the Hunter S. Thompson, the Charles Bukowski, the Jack Kerouac of rock writing, all rolled into one.
Growing up with ease and comfort, but fast, about as fast as you could imagine, short of some primitive tribe's brutal confirmation, using LSD as a rite of passage like you're supposed to be able to use the army. Things sometimes get a bit complicated.
Everybody grows up somewhere, so this was it, the box, El Cajon, the hot box, the soup that we grew up in.
Desperately, I wanted my writing not to ring true, because if it rang true, it was adolescent, and that was 7 leagues below hack.
The apartment complexes that were there then are the ones that I lived in.
I remember my father telling me that a lot of streets were dirt.
I mention apartments because I think the whole city's sort of comprised of apartments, and so I think that brings about, you know, obviously poorer people, and how do you deal with that? And a lot of times I think you deal with that is by creating things. So I think that's what Lester did with it.
I think maybe that volcanic activity that was pressured and pressured kind of exploded there and made him, in some little part, what he was.
I'd write for love with an artificial energy that betrayed all of puppy love's sickly fatigue, each day at least one outpouring of confusion and desire and violence. And then I'd shove it in the drawer with all the others, and then perhaps I'd drag my weary satisfaction to the bathroom, snatching a stray magazine along the way in hopes of encountering some slim filly squatting palms to chest in a girdle advertisement. And once inside, I'd lock the door, tear down my pants, turn half around and lift the toilet's lid, finally to sit myself down on my throne and commence jacking off triumphantly.
There was a thriving music scene here in El Cajon.
The popularity of country western music began to grow.
Well, my dad played the Bostonia many times.
Country western musicians were playing more and more at the Bostonia Ballroom.
As far as live music, there was always the Saturday night dances at the high schools.
And then the El Cajon High School dances on the Saturday nights, they had a great band called the Marauders playing there, you know, and there was a bunch of bands around. The Nomads were kind of like a rhythm and blues band.
Early groups like the Sleepy Hollow and Funky Buckwheat.
Essie and the Showmen, 10-piece soul band. Essie was like the miniature James Brown, jumping off the stage and doing the splits and just kicking, man. It was great.
In the mid-60s, it started to open up.
Iron Butterfly started, but before that, they were called Jerry and the Geratones.
Danny Weiss, one of the original members of the Iron Butterfly, went to El Cajon High School.
Jack Penny, who was at that time the Iron Butterfly drummer. Marcia and the Esquire, the Lyrics, Glory, Jerry Rainey and Jack Penny's band.
The Carneymen, a bunch of Mexican guys, which, you know, carny means meat, so the Meat Men. You know?
Mother Goose, which was a rather legendary group here in town.
And there were so many more clubs back then.
Jerry Herrera, the owner and promoter of the club Palace, had a nightclub out on Cuyamaca called Powerhouse. Chetley Hall, the building is still at First and Greenfield.
Bands were drawn to El Cajon because of the Hi-Ho Club. It was the coolest place to play.
The Strawberry Long Clock actually played the Hi-Ho in one of the opening nights there.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on.
No formulations for the future except fantasies where I tramped the sloping sidewalks of North Beach or Greenwich Village, a poet madman king in Dada-colored cast-off rags.
Lester Bangs' family background was unique, to say the least.
I probably met Lester Bangs when I was 14 at a Jehovah's Witness event.
We're talking about something that one of his relatives called the closed circle, a really tight-knit group of three families that were interconnected: the Ketchings, the Bangses, and the Cliftons. It was a closed circle in the sense that many of the key members were Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, the first time I met Lester Bangs was at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses about 2 blocks from here on Claydell and El Cajon.
And it's a religion I think still a lot of people in America don't understand. It was a growing religion based on the belief that the world was going to end at a very specific time and place.
His mom was really into that religion, and my mom was going to that church too, so it's like we just happened to be there at the same time, and there was Lester there, and there was Milt Wyatt. Well, all three of us get ready to start 8th grade.
Celebrations of holidays, birthdays, or Christmas, music, anything celebratory of this world was not part of the Jehovah's Witness religion. His mother, Norma Bell Clifton,
I remember going to the beach with Norma,
had already buried one husband and raised 3 children who were out on their own living as adults when she met a man named Conway Bangs.
and she would drive an old Mercury. All the windows were up, it was summer, because she didn't want a draft or something, you know. So we're driving and everybody's dying of heat, and all the windows were up. It was just quirky, but she would always need the wheel.
Because home was a dizzy hive, glutted with books and records and reams of type jam paper. Once past living room skirmishes with an old-time Bible mother declaiming her ailments, and on weekends there was the Kingdom Hall for me to stew in.
Conway had a troubled past. He was an alcoholic. He'd done time in prison, 10 years for assault, where it was noted prophetically on his record that he was intemperate, he liked to drink, he used tobacco, and he was disdainful of organized religion. How did this woman fall in love with a guy who was a drinker, who hated organized religion when she was a strict and super devout Jehovah's Witness? I think it's a bit of a mystery. Many people in the family suggested to me, as Lester's biographer, that it was a reclamation project. She was going to save Conway Bangs' soul. She got a child out of it, Leslie Conway Bangs. He was born December 13th, 1948, a few minutes after midnight, in Escondido. The family would live for a time in Arizona, eventually settle after Conway's death in El Cajon. Conway did not stop drinking. He did not become a Jehovah's Witness. I think there was a lot of stress in Norma and Conway's marriage. He was proud of his son, but there were troubles there. And at one point he left, and he was staying with a friend, and in an alcoholic stupor he drank himself to sleep, and the house burned down, and Lester's father burned to death. I think the fact that Lester could never mourn the death of this father, who in many ways he idealized as a strong life force, had repercussions throughout his life.
Friday nights and Sunday nights pressure cooking my torpid, squandered rage, while Saturday was swallowed by TV and long lawn wallowings, the motley number of us in the neighborhood's combined comic book collections, until at last, great God, chicks!
On Thursday it was a small meeting, maybe of 20 people, a family Bible study. And it would be for an hour, and we'd show up 20 minutes early and leave 20 minutes after. So Norma would serve a little cake or coffee or something. So there would be a little time period where Lester and I would have time in his room listening to music and talking and growing up together. But it was definitely those Thursdays that we bonded for a couple of years.
I think that there's an analogy here to be made in the way that Lester, when no music was in his household for many years, eventually discovered music, the way it became everything to him, something he was addicted to, something that was life itself for him.
I remember going over to Lester's house and being amazed at how poorly he kept his room up. It was like his mom's part of the house was like completely immaculate. It was actually shocking to go in his room. Half-eaten bowl of Cheerios that had been sitting on the floor for like a week or something, you know, spoiled milk in there, and whatever, just crap all over the place.
The Jehovah's Witnesses are unique among all organized religions in that music is not a part of their gatherings, because music is the window to the devil.
He was close to his mother. He was. He didn't have his dad. I think he did care about his mom, and she definitely cared about him. It was oil and water to some degree, but they grew up together, and they were all they had.
Well, I took all that stuff seriously. Kissing appendages seemed real romantic to me, just like the summer before, when I'd sat on the floor in our living room gorging myself on the opportunity to kiss and tongue and suck on Sandra Wyatt's glorious calf, while she sat in the chair above me, holding one of my hands between her knees and watching Saturday afternoon wrestling with a slight amusement that only drove me wilder, even though I was so intoxicated with her calf and my own muddled conception of what I was doing, or supposed to be, that I didn't get any farther than maybe the soft backside of one knee that afternoon. Although I did get more later, running my hand up her dress to stop at her panties in the back seat of the Jehovah's Witness car filled with watchtowers and awakes. Maybe they were trying to line us up to get married so we'd both be kept out of trouble by each other. Somewhere in the back seat on the way home from the San Diego Zoo with my mother and her mother and Goofus of a 7th grade brother up front.
He did have a little crush on my sister. He could have been my brother-in-law. Hey.
One of the things that's often forgotten as we're talking about the performers and musicians of El Cajon is the popularity of records. There were other record stores in San Diego, such as Fender's and Thurl's, as well as a couple of record stores here in El Cajon. So people had access.
I used to go over to his house, I guess pretty much from 9th grade on. I'd go over to his house and he'd play me Charles Mingus and Coltrane, and he was into the jazz phase before the Beatles invasion.
Yeah, I could talk to Lester about music, even though this was the early 60s, probably about 62, I'm guessing. He had a bunch of records that were pre-Beatle which is a big milestone. And they were in 50s music, like jazz 50s, not Elvis 50s, but jazz 50s.
I'll never forget Lester sitting me down and saying, "You have to listen to this." I thought, what the hell is this? It was totally out of my comfort zone, and it was really atonal and free out jazz.
Lester was lucky in that he had a 4 years elder nephew, Ben Cajon III. He's older than Lester, but he's Lester's nephew because of the strange family tree of this closed circle. And he was very interested in jazz. He was interested in literature. He was interested in to some extent, the beat poets.
Lester was like a nonconformist from the beginning, and I think he was searching for that in the books that he was reading. He was reading Kerouac and Burroughs and all that stuff when he was just in his early and mid-teens. And I think that's kind of what led him to jazz.
He discovered all of this and more through Ben, going record shopping with him, falling in love with bebop jazz. The more extreme, the better. Anything that was an alternative to the boxed-in world of El Cajon and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And it is here a great literary metaphor that El Cajon literally means the box.
Charles Mingus was a big favorite of his, and he found Coltrane and some of the people like that, and he somehow related to that music because I think it was rebellious, it had no boundaries.
I think Lester spent all the years until he hit about 12 or 13 inside a box, and then he broke out in a big way. Thanks in part to nephew Ben.
The Beatles and the whole English invasion scene started happening. That's when Lester really started getting into it.
And I'd go over to his house and he was into the Rolling Stones. He was a huge Rolling Stones fan, and then also the Yardbirds, big Yardbirds fan. So he was into the English music, and he got really into the more bluesy sounding stuff. He preferred the guitars to be slightly out of tune.
He traded me a Jazz Giants 58 for the Kinks' You Really Got Me album. Sort of like a Tom Sawyer, you know, I'll let you paint the fence for free. You know, he convinced me that Charles Mingus was better than Ray Davies and that I should have it and we should exchange, and we did, and I still have it.
Ben Cajon would be the first to tell you that he was a voracious kid with this undeniable life force, and that soon was exerting itself in the way he embraced music, drugs, literature, writing, any sort of experience he could have.
He really, really liked the lead guitar in You Really Got Me, which was so non-melodic. That was just a bunch of gibberish, screeching, which was really kind of different and cool, and he really ate that up. He loved that.
Because I knew that somewhere, Greenwich Village, my city in the sky, there lounged lovely sidewalks full of strange, sleek, dementedly beautiful females capable of appreciating my holy madness and the scriptures it spewed.
Lester only applied himself to things that he was genuinely interested in.
And when in my junior year I finally poked my fuzzy snout and small pink eyes from my burrow, it really didn't mean much, although my whole facade made a 360-degree retract, having braved and transcended the cold fires of existential nihilism.
The drama teacher, who was named Keith Richards, said that he had a student of his that I thought might be interested in and might become friends with, and his name was Lester Bangs. We were in the speech department, in the drama department, and we were friends with kids in the band and orchestra. And through the drama department, we engaged in plays. We did Tea House of the August Moon, we did Damn Yankees. We got a broad-based education in the arts and in culture and in, you know, sciences and mathematics and everything else.
We had the same biology class together, and in biology class he handed me a copy of his book of the week, which was Burroughs' Naked Lunch. Everywhere you open it, there's obscene, wild, crazy, sexual, pornographic book. But Lester had given me that book, and we both kind of got thrown out of class that day.
We read about William Burroughs in his days as a junkie. We read on the road, and we read about Kerouac and his adventures in New York City and traveling around the country looking for kicks, looking for adventures, looking for hot women.
You know, Lester wasn't really into sports or anything like that. You know, he would usually ditch out on gym class. And the way to make that up would be you'd have to write a story on sports. So it got to the point where Lester just never suited up for gym class. He'd just sit around and, you know, read or something. So it got to the point where he was going to get an F in gym class, you know. So he shows up with this whole big booklet, you know, it's just full, and it's supposed to be a sporting event. So he goes, "Here, Jerry, I'm handing this into Coach Foster. What do you think?" And then I look at it and I go, it's entitled, "Hector the Homosexual Monkey." Well, I don't think he's going to like it. So he hands it in, and then pretty soon he was just gone.
He meets this young woman, Andrea Di Guglielmo. She's exuberant. She's another example of a life force that has been denied to him.
They were sort of two peas in a pod.
He was smarter than the rest of us, let's put it that way, you know, and he was kind of like a hip nerd, you know.
She's theatrical. She has been in high school plays and such. She runs around with a long cape that's very mod and Carnaby Street. She's kind of exotic, you know, Mary Quant makeup, and it's the 60s, it's that mod look. She's a fish out of water, and so is he, in a very much more extreme way. And she gives him the time of day. Andy describes really loving him, too, his life force. They're very different. She had a very conservative Republican father. Her views kind of mimicked his, and Lester was a budding liberal conscience. I think in the way that they both had a lust for life, that was what got them excited. They would go see foreign films in downtown San Diego, taking the bus in from El Cajon. They would eat on Navy Pier. They would get their photos taken in the photo booth. And Lester thought he'd found the perfect person for him.
Granted, I started at the very top of the San Diego totem, by God, with college hipster parties at which I was always the youngest one. And yes, indeed, I held my own admirably, being somewhat new to alcohol, though not to pot, joyfully drunk, astoundingly gregarious after a couple of warm-up glasses of wine. I circulated from one group to another, spouting spontaneous poetry and impressing the pop-eyed hell out of all of them, always doing things like raising wine bottles over my head and saying, "Ah, the golden flowing river of sunshine joy."
We read literature. We read the existentialist writers from Europe in the post-war era. We read Henry Miller, we read poetry of Ginsberg, we read W.H. Auden, Norman Mailer, Faulkner. Lester was constantly on the lookout for strange personalities.
But of course I didn't cool it. I never cooled it because alcohol always turned me into a Zen lunatic. It was really all involuntary. I was just hip from the core of my 16-year-old soul to the jigsaw jumping charge of joyous jive that vibrated around me as I moved from room to room, blazing in my eye as I ad-lib motley, flatulent streams of, quote, poetry.
When the British bands hit America, you know, right away, bands were forming overnight across the country. There were literally tens of thousands of bands on every other block in every other town, including El Cajon. And in El Cajon, the resident band was The Dark Ages. They held court at the Hi-Ho Club.
Jack Butler and I formed the band The Dark Ages.
The Hi-Ho Club was probably the preeminent teen nightclub ever in San Diego.
It would stand up to any, you know, showcase club in the nation.
That's where Lester Bangs used to come and sit in on a harmonica.
Inspired by Brian Jones of the Stones and Keith Relf of the Yardbirds.
And it was just packed.
He'd get up with the Dark Ages as kind of their guest harmonica player.
They had the side room too, the geisha room, where they had other bands.
Lester was not a schooled musician. He just loved music, and he just sort of channeled his energy into the harmonica. From what I understand, it was just really free-form harmonica noise.
Lester did everything flat out. Everything he did at a furious pace. When he was writing, he was writing like crazy. When he wanted to be a musician, he would get out his harmonica and just blow on it.
And as for what else I did before I began to get bald, well, I used to fill my days with huddling by the record player, digging music that fed my nascent sense of sexual identity, like the Trogs.
We'd bring Lester up to play harmonica with us over there, and we turned out being the house band.
Lester Bangs used to come in with his harmonica. We'd be doing a Yardbirds rave up, and he'd come up and blow on I'm a Man.
We'd introduce Lester as the greatest harmonica player in San Diego, you know, which he wasn't, but you know, but it worked, you know. It was cool. He'd have a blast.
He would play harmonica, Jerry Rennie would sing, and he would just rip it up. He'd come in quite often in a long overcoat and with his harmonicas and just wail up on the stage, just a big ball of energy. He played the same thing on every song. We'd have him play on different songs, and he pretty much played the same thing, and it worked. It was really a lot of fun.
He wrote later that you know, the Dark Ages really loved playing their Yardbirds covers, but like every band, they had to do, you know, any songs that were hits at the time just to keep the people dancing. And he said they always kind of held their noses when they would do stuff like Psychotic Reaction by the Count Five, you know, and Lester says that, you know, he couldn't understand that because Psychotic Reaction was pretty much I'm a Man by the Yardbirds mixed in with Secret Agent Man by Johnny Rivers.
Days home from school faking flu, I would put Train on loud as my Sears Silvertone could blare and stand up on a hassock reading Allen Ginsberg's Hal at the top of my lungs, pretending I was in a North Beach or Greenwich Village coffee house. Music fueled me, although I was just dimly realizing that I was at core a verbal child. In the shower, I wailed and whammed at imaginary keyboards, drums, later guitars, but most especially saxes, emulating my heroes with 20-minute atonal ragas that soared to their stormiest climaxes when the hot water ended.
He was kind of goofy looking, awkwardly flailing around.
Lester was already questioning that double standard that the musicians had, because I think Lester wasn't really a musician. He was just, you know, a seeker of authenticity in art.
I remember playing some places and he would come and play harmonica and sing Wooly Bully. He had 2 songs that were his songs and we knew we could call him up to do that, you know, just to goof around and do it. It wasn't that great.
He took a stand for those bands, those local bands like the Count Five and Question Mark and the Mysterians that later on they kind of came to be looked down upon by rock critics as being, you know, sort of unmusical because their songs all had a couple of chords, you know, 2 or 3 chords, and there was no lyrical sophistication. But Lester was saying that's what rock and roll is supposed to be. That's what music's supposed to be. It's supposed to just be direct communication, lots of energy and attitude, and it didn't matter about the virtuosity.
Thought magazine was a creative journal at El Cajon High. Some of my friends worked on it, actually. It's funny that Lester wrote for the same thing, and you know, 40 years before us.
I was sitting around one Monday evening jamming and drinking port with my buddies Roger and Tim. We are starting this Stooges-type rock band which has at various times been named such things as Crime Desire, Cannibal Rape Job, Romular Jag, Cigar Box Joe Bob in the Clap, and it is currently called National Dust since we are going through our down to rudimentals period. I blow harp and sing lead on some tunes.
He didn't want to live a conventional life. He didn't want to have conventional ideas. He looked for things that no one else thought of. He wanted to experience things that no one else, at least no one else in his circle of friends, had ever done.
The other factor making it difficult for me to kick out the jams in peace was that the apartment right under the one occupied by myself and my own sainted mother was rented to somebody else I went to high school with, namely one of the stupidest, ugliest pugs I ever knew named Butch Duggar, and he just happened to have grown up to be a cop. A kid who lived in the apartment house told me once that Duggar had been heard saying he had remembered me from school, had never liked me, and now had sworn that he was going to, quote, get me. His words.
He was a rebel, I guess you would say. He was, at least he thought of himself as a Jesse James wannabe criminal. He identified more with his father than he ever did with his mother. His father was an ex-con, and when he got into trouble with the police and with petty larceny and shoplifting and the things that he got in trouble with, he played it up. It was a role for him. It was a way for him to transcend his identity as a teenager in suburban Southern California.
When I started playing for Andy, Mrs. Brown began to yell, "Hey in there, stop that racket and open this door right now." But I finished my recital, Andy laughing, and told her to hold on a second. I answered the door with axe in hand. The landlady was fuming. "What are you doing in there?"
We had friends. We had a large number of friends at El Cajon High School at the time. They had the surfing crowd, and they had the leather guys, and the punks, and we had the future farmers.
Eventually, Roger and Tim arrived, and we went out for more booze, although Tim was back to his old regiment of reds and whites. In fact, as he proudly brought his stash out to show us, he fumbled, dropping the bag. I made a note of the ones that rolled under the couch and the chair, planning to gather them later. After putting what he found of his stuff away, he picked up the axe. I had already told him about the scene with the landlady, and Tim blew a few farting honks.
He was so aware of various intervals, of influences, of various people from European literature, from the New York scene, from the Beats particularly, the filmmakers, Kenneth Anger, Fellini, Francois Truffaut, and Jean-Luc Godard.
When you reach 16, 17, etc., you begin to question certain things, and so you want to think for yourself and break out and try to figure it out yourself.
We were aware that this country was changing. These were all things that we intuitively knew about from reading the newspapers, reading the Life magazines and the other magazines of the time, and watching on television and seeing the movies. You know, so it wasn't that we were isolated. We were simply in a suburban area that was somewhat sleepy, part of the larger Southern California culture.
I thought that Lester did want to become rich and famous as a rock star, and that's why he's going to form a band, and it was take the shortcut to fame and have a lot of fun partying doing it. But apparently I was wrong. At that point, he was kind of resenting the rock stars that were rich and famous, and he was more into the 13th floor elevators or the Count Five or the thrashy stuff, the garage stuff that was basically the same as the band that I was playing, that he sat in with.
His mother certainly did not approve of Lester having friends. She wanted him to focus on the church. That was the last thing Lester wanted to do. He wanted to get as far away from the church as possible. He did not want to read the Bible.
Compared to a lot of other religions, pretty repressive in not being able to have freedoms, celebrations of either birthday or Christmas or Halloween or almost anything else. So there's a reason for it, I'm sure, but it just didn't seem like it was a good enough reason when you're growing up.
And when he resisted, the church tried to rein him in, and when he resisted some more, they excommunicated him. He exploded in rage and said, "No, you guys are all a bunch of hypocrites. I don't want to have anything to do with you."
Growing up, they would have different speeches where you would have as a young person, you would have a 7-minute speech, and when you got old enough and strong enough, you would have a 10-minute, then a 12 or 15, a 20, and then a 30, and then the big hour. And I remember one night going to the hall on Claydell Street here in El Cajon. It's still there. He had like a 10-minute, 12-minute talk on a certain subject, and he was about 2 or 3 minutes into it, not very far, and he was kind of struggling, and then he just let it out. There were some 4-letter words that had never been spoken in there.
And the famous story, of him going up in front of the congregation and basically telling them, "You're full of shit. You're a bunch of hypocrites." That was, and he quit the church.
Kind of got up there and got him out of there, and it was, and that was the end of that.
And that tore his mother to pieces. That was like the second biggest tragedy in her life after losing her husband. I couldn't say if he believed in God or not. He probably went through a period of complete atheism, but then he wasn't a secularist either. His model was always William Burroughs, and William Burroughs was somebody who defied categorization.
The El Cajon years for Lester Bangs aren't exactly what probably a lot of people think they are. He came to Grossmont and actually in 2 years completed enough units to transfer to San Diego State.
My first semester in college, I asked an English teacher of mine what he thought about a current literary movement. He had never heard of it. Right now, I'm engaged in a reinvestigation of Greek drama.
He was an excellent writer, extremely intelligent, and engaged on campus. He participated in the speech/forensics program, wrote for the school paper, took journalism classes and creative writing classes, and excelled in all of these classes. What I think is kind of funny is you see the picture of Bangs as kind of this tie-dyed hippie, and at Grossmont he was a nerdy kind of preppy guy.
I was just beginning to realize that I was coming up in the dawning days of a new era, when literature would turn to toilet paper, daily news would become surrealistic, and artists of all stripes everywhere would feel blissfully free to cut themselves loose from their heritage, because there was more relevance to be found in the splashy trash of the popular press, in the open-throated yelps and mechanical twangs of rock and roll, in the chaotic inner jungles which all of us hurled ourselves into with every type of drug imaginable.
His girlfriend Andy was here as well, and she was involved with drama and he was involved with speech. And I think what's really stands out to me is how much he was involved at Grossmont, and how much, he did his time here in 2 years.
The consciousness of all of this was a vague cloud distantly forming then, but I followed my as-yet masked muse even so, by reading trashy tabloids instead of enduring literature, and spending much more time under my headphones, filling my shimmying soul with rock and roll than I spent reading anything. By writing 8 to 12 hours in a row on innumerable all-night binges, piling up reams of raving bullshit, but honing my talents all the time, until at last I began to speak in a voice almost my own.
During the years he was living in El Cajon, he was living with his mom, who was conservative, and he rebelled quite a bit against her religion and her way of living. So he tried to move out twice. The first time he tried to move out, I think he was living over by Granite Hills High School in a meat locker in a left-wing commune, trying to break free and rebel. And he lived there for a while. That didn't go too well. And then the second time was when he moved out and lived near the Hells Angels.
The first New Year's I have a clear memory of was probably the first one I was old enough to get drunk for. I got stoned on nutmeg instead. We drove aimlessly around El Cajon, inevitably ending in the line at Jack in the Box, where, as people vomited all over the inside of my car, I said, "Welcome to 1967.
We do have records of some of the books that Lester Bangs checked out while he was at Grossmont, and he was a Hunter S. Thompson fan.
And of course, later, Lester and I were roommates right after high school on the infamous Tobacco Road over on Ballantyne.
Andy had a play rehearsal at school immediately after dinner, so I rode up with her, intending to listen to a record I'd seen in the listening library a few days before called The Sounds of Harlem. Unfortunately, I had forgotten that the library was closed on Friday nights, so I spent the time watching the play rehearsal, although I had already seen it 3 times. After a few minutes, I slipped out for a moment and took 3 Libriums at the water fountain. The drama kids invited us to a party afterwards, and my boredom and Librium-deadened heart lifted at the pleasant expectation that perhaps I'd be able to do a little drinking.
We lived next door to the Hells Angels clubhouse.
And it was a little rough, and it was, you could be loud.
So I lived there with Lester and another guy, and none of us were overly friendly with them. We'd hang with them and they'd tell us stories of their exploits.
And I remember hearing music over there and seeing Lester over there. And
they were just kind of outlaws, they were pirates.
Ah, these drama people, how they love to perform. Excusing myself to make the head, I pushed in the lock on the door and turned on the faucet to drown out the squeak of hinges as I opened the medicine cabinet to look for likely pills and prescription vials. The old babe had a large jar of Darvon. I scooped out a dozen or so and was pleasantly surprised to find 2 solitary, peculiar colored capsules. Barbiturates! I had never seen pills that looked like this before, but somehow you just know these things.
We lived in houses that were up on blocks. It was like some strange alien wasteland of houses, and the rent was dirt cheap. And actually there wasn't any other people. Most of the other houses on blocks, there was nobody living in them. I think there was a couple, but there must have been 10 houses up on blocks, and most of them were empty.
All his friends that he was living with on Tobacco Road in El Cajon, they were all listening to the first Creem album and the first couple of Hendrix albums, you know, and Clapton and Hendrix were the new guitar gods, and they would just sneer at Lester because he would be listening to the Velvet Underground.
He wouldn't even jam with us. He would just go in his room, put his headphones on, and listen to whatever he was listening to. And then he would, when we weren't rehearsing, he would come out and he'd say, "You have to listen to this."
Or he would be playing old doo-wop records, or he would be playing the Seeds and the Music Machine. And I think he liked to do that to sort of annoy what he considered to be the musical snobbery of his musician friends.
That Benny still had me kind of nervous, so I made it to a darkened corner and lay back in an old chair, too speeded to sleep or read, but not nearly speeded enough to write, in a kind of depression which made me decide against using any of the Darvons or barbiturates.
Towards the end of the 2 years that Lester Bangs spent at Grossmont, he was at a party at the bungalows in El Cajon, where he'd been living, where some Hells Angels were living as well. And there was a party there that got out of control, and there was a rape that happened there.
Some of the Angels had abducted a woman and took her back to their house next door against her will, because I heard that she had bad-mouthed an angel or something like that. Oh, there goes one now.
Lester was moved by it, and he wrote a story about it. And he brought the story to a creative writing class where he was attacked not so much for what he had written, but for the fact that he didn't intervene. And at that point, Lester was a pretty scrawny guy, and I think it would have been impossible for him to intervene.
I think Lester might have gone over to watch for a little, just to see what the situation was all about, and came right back over, and he didn't really look like it was a cool thing. Right after I moved out, they had let the woman go, of course, and she went directly to the police, and the police came directly to that Hells Angels house and arrested everyone there. Lester got sucked up in that bust, and I had just barely escaped. But I know that it wasn't good, and it was enough to make the police come and arrest everyone in their house and arrest everyone in the house next door.
Suddenly, Silly Willie burst through the front door in a shorty Japanese-type bathrobe, eyes gleaming, and said, "Hey, you fuckers, how would you like to rip yourselves off a nice, juicy fuck tonight? We got a broad over here, and she's fucking with everybody, man. I already got mine, and some of the guys are going twice."
It was a formative experience for him, from what I understand, because it made him look at his writing differently and how he would be perceived and how he would, pursue his career as a writer, and actually sent him into a bit of a funk where he kind of locked himself up in his house and really thought about what he was doing.
We both tried to explore alternative ways of perceiving reality. As a result, we started reading about drugs. We started reading about altered states of consciousness, none of which we were able to experience because we were young high school students living in suburbia where nothing like that was available. And so we improvised. Lester improvised a little bit more than I did. We tried nutmeg.
There's one memory of Lester when we're just driving around, and he said, "Let's drive through Jack in the Box. Trust me on this, let's get a couple chocolate shakes."
Lemon extract. We tried consuming all kinds of things.
And so we drove in, we ordered 2 chocolate shakes at Jack in the Box, and then we pulled into the parking lot, and he said, "Okay, give me your shake." And I gave him my shake, and he took this thing of nutmeg that he had ground up and heavily dumped tons of nutmeg on both the chocolate shakes. And I thought, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, you'll get high. This will get you high. It's like a natural high. You'll get high from nutmeg." I went, "Whatever, okay." And so he did this, and we drank the chocolate shakes. They tasted really funky. He didn't like it, and I don't remember feeling anything.
We tried Marazine, which was a seasickness pill or a motion sickness pill, and taking a bottle of that would basically induce kind of a psychotic reaction that lasted for hours. We had the Wyman inhalers. That was the thing that we discovered. It was a asthma medicine that was an inhaler, and if you could break the inhaler, you would find this coated piece of cotton wick inside it, and if you cut even a little tiny piece of this wick off, and if you could swallow it, and it was hard to swallow because it was adulterated with some kind of nasty chemical, but if you could get even a little tiny bit of it down, man, you would be electrified for hours. We discovered Romalar cough syrup. He's found something that he loved. He could drink a bottle of Romalar and he would be a raving lunatic for hours on end. That Lester made a systematized list of all these various kinds of pills and things that he could that he could use that were legal over-the-counter medicines. In the late 60s, at the top of Mount Helix, became this huge open-air drug mart where people would get whatever was available. I mean, El Cajon went from being, there was absolutely nothing available, and then all of a sudden everything was available. We had amphetamines of various sorts. We had White Crosses. You could take some White Crosses and stay up all night, and Lester would love that. He would take the speed, and when he was old enough to buy liquor, he would always have beer and whiskey on hand. Lester did more drugs, drank more, experimented harder, went at it harder than anybody else. It was kind of scary to be around him at times.
1968, I went to a party where everybody drank too much vodka too fast and pawed each other or tried to while Donovan trilled a Fat Angels. Only saw one person vomit, my girlfriend, all over her brand new white hip huggers. When I got home, I hallucinated all kinds of people coming into my room and reaching out to them screaming, "Don't dissolve! Don't dissolve!" But sure enough, they did. Then I thought I saw a friend of mine silhouetted behind the window shade whispering from the garden, "Lester! Lester!" I leapt out of bed and yanked up the shade, pathetically grateful for some human companionship. There was nothing there but the empty street with leaves blowing.
And cause the blind to see. And then I cried, "Dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit." And somehow Jesus came and brought to me the victory.
Lester was a really curious person, and that's something that I think is kind of rare. And searching through bins at the drugstore to find the best music is something that not everybody does. And I think there's something special about that. And I think just thinking that he walked the same halls as me and I feel like I'm a curious person too. Like I'm always looking for something that's like authentic and real and good. And I think I just kind of relate to that mostly about him, is that he was a curious digger.
Today, Andy Warhol was assassinated. Well, I shouldn't say assassinated. He was shot by some chick who wanted to murder him, and right now he's in critical condition. 50-50 chance or so, they say.
Lester's reputation preceded him. At that time, bangs was a euphemism for, rock and roll.
I was over at my girlfriend Andy's today listening to my new William Burroughs album for the first time. It just came in the mail, when suddenly they shouted for me from the bedroom. When I went in, Andy's mother told me the news. Somehow I got the feeling they were expecting me to get distraught or something, so I faked this bunch of guffaws.
During the great handball scare of the late 60s, we would all hunker down at the handball court on First Avenue. And a kid just walked up to me and asked me, "I'm looking for Lester Bangs. Do you know where he lived?" And I really didn't. But for some reason, I pointed down the street and told him, yeah, he lived in one of those apartment buildings. Well, it turned out he did, just by happenstance.
Gradually, over the months, I began to find out that Warhol had little or nothing to do with the movies under his name. Roger met Warhol, or an imposter, as has been rumored since, and Paul Morrissey, who seems to be the real man responsible for the films, when they came to lecture at San Diego State.
Lester didn't buy into the whole hippie peace and love thing, though I think a lot of that was a sort of a media creation anyway. I mean, he was, as a kid in the sort of working class El Cajon, how was he going to relate to like flower power? He could tell that was just media BS.
Yesterday, Andy Warhol was shot in his New York office. Today, Robert Kennedy in an LA hotel lounge just as he was finishing his victory speech after winning the California primary. And just 2 months ago, almost to the day, Martin Luther King, a far better man than either of the other two, was murdered in Memphis by a hired assassin who still eludes the FBI.
I have to tell you, he looked nothing like I had expected.
He would wear a suit and tie When he went to college, man, he'd wear a sport coat and slacks and tasseled loafers.
When I entered the room, I was going to look behind Les and say, is Lester Bangs here? But it was really him.
I watched the TV coverage of the immediate aftermath of his shooting with my jaw hanging, stupefied and shocked in the same way I'd been those interminable leagues of moments that I sat in the Angels' living room watching the progress of their gang rape.
I wasn't let down, but I was just a little bit surprised.
The data on the TV began to repeat itself. No new developments. I said goodnight to Andy and drove to Valley Liquor to pick up some easy erase typing paper for the philosophy paper I'd planned to write on this all-night speed session. As I paid for it, I casually said to the clerk, "Did you hear the news about Bobby Kennedy?" And he said, passing time of day with customer, "Yeah, they're going to have to stop doing those things."
When he had his job as a shoe salesman at Stryker's Shoes in Mission Valley, that was the way he dressed for his job, which he was carrying off at exactly the same time. He was going to Grossmont College, and at the same time he was experimenting with Romalar and staying drunk half the time. And it wasn't until later on that he cultivated the mustache and the punk look.
I can't cry this morning, even though America is disintegrating with a rapidity that's even shocking some of the dissidents, as I feel the total tornado of the cosmos whirling around me like a jacuzzi whirlpool bath, as all the Grossmont Junior College speakers used to say.
He was always about authenticity, authenticity of, just telling the truth. I mean, I think that's one reason his first published review in Rolling Stone was the Kick Out the Jams by the MC5, and he panned it because he thought all their sort of political left-wing, up against the wall motherfuckers attitude, he thought that was, he just thought that was completely bogus and a sham when they were signed to like Elektra Records and everything, and he called him out on it.
What inspires a lot of us with regards to Lester is his search, I think, for authenticity. El Cajon is in the shadow of San Diego, and it has this kind of smooth veneer of the beaches and this beautiful America's finest city. And growing up sort of in the shadow in El Cajon, we grew up under slogans like "There's no life east of I-5." But there is life, and I think in many ways it's more authentic.
Although it sure ain't no secret, I feel the lid's about to blow. Driving Andy to school, suddenly after half our transit done in silence, she says, "America is disintegrating, Les."
He couldn't get rid of me. It was routine. Literally, I would go over to his house every afternoon if I saw his little Triumph car sitting out front from school. He called me up and asked me if I could come over. He had, for some reason, left his Triumph up at Grossmont College and needed somebody to go up and drive his car back. He would man the other car, his girlfriend's car. He came by, picked me up. We went up to Grossmont. He threw me the keys. I got in his Triumph. I was driving it. I'll never forget going down Fletcher Parkway, and we'd stop at a light, and Bangs had a cigar going, and he'd be looking out I remember later on, I figured I thought that he had looked so much like Ernie Kovacs with that cigar looking out and that mustache of his.
I said to Andy that I'd foreseen the seam ripping of America's frayed old frock coat, and I added, "I suppose it couldn't be otherwise." And she said, "Democracy won't work. It's a shame, but it just won't work." And I said, "The reason it's falling apart this way is that the people of America have been living in the past too long. For too long, we've broadcasted the American dream on all networks as gospel, and everybody's been content, living in the past."
He looked to intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre without really reading what Sartre was, or existentialism without really knowing what existentialism was, or really going into a deep study of any of it. He just looked for whatever things that could get him out of the Christian mindset of his mother. When I first met him, I wanted to know, what are you? Are you a Democrat or Republican? And I remember him saying to me, "I'm an anarchist." He wanted to be Henry Miller. He wanted to be Antonin Artaud. And he wanted to be these kind of anarchistic intellectuals.
I won't deny it. For all I know, she's pretty right. In fact, I'm sure she is. Those hysterical, paranoid new left idiots are just as much to blame as anybody. America, which is essentially our universe, is having earthquake-sized convulsions, choking, spitting up blood, reeling dizzily into some crumpling, limp, fall down of terminal disease, weaving back and forth on its knees, moaning and clutching itself tightly in one wounded area after another, raving like a wood grain alcoholic crashing in the Bowery on his last go-round. Maybe these cats just want to see the entire structure fall, or at least get shaken to its quick, for once simply because it's never happened before.
Rock criticism didn't even exist before Paul and Williams started Crawdaddy magazine. And that would be, I believe in late 66, early 67, certainly at least 9-10 months before Jan Wenner started publishing Rolling Stone, which would be the next magazine that was taking rock and addressing it as a serious art form and not looking at it as a teeny bopper pop phenomenon that it basically was up to this point in time. You had actual intellectuals with an artistic background who understood things beyond the keen of an 11-year-old.
That was about the time he was starting to write album reviews for Rolling Stone magazine.
1969, me and a bunch of buddies went cruising in some dude's jalopy. We beered a while to no avail. One pal who later joined the Navy where he majored in underwater demolition said, "It's real fun blowing up stuff. Let's go out and get us some scrunt." Nobody else said anything. Eventually, we all went home too depressed even to feel drunk and fell asleep.
The first one I ever remember him writing was Cheech and Chong's first album. Most of the review of the album was him just talking about how much he liked Mexican girls, Then he got into that, and he thought they were funny and everything. And was kind of turning into this little folk hero in town.
The label got lost during shipping. The cream is worth the whipping, but I feel your grip is slipping, so please, candle with hair.
I'm not sure whether we can pinpoint what made him first start sending reviews to Rolling Stone. I imagine he probably picked up Rolling Stone, saw some of the reviews in there and thought, I could do better than that. And started sending stuff off. And at that point, they probably weren't inundated with a lot of reviews. It was a new field.
He always liked pretty weird things, he's a big Captain Beefheart fan. Captain Beefheart came out with the weirdest album that anybody's ever come out with, I think, called Trout Mass Replica. And Lester wrote a good review on that. I remember Captain Beefheart invited him up to his ranch somewhere up in the San Joaquin Valley. Went up to visit him, and I guess they probably sat around and ate peyote that he'd grown up there or something.
All of a sudden he was somebody. He had a voice. And people were reading his stuff.
About a month ago, the MC5 received a cover article in Rolling Stone proclaiming them the new sensation, a group to break all barriers, kick out the jams, total energy thing, etc., etc., etc. Never mind that they came on like a bunch of 16-year-old punks on a meth power trip. These boys, so the line ran, could play their guitars like John Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders played sax. Well, the album is out now, and we can all judge for ourselves. For my money, they come on more like Blue Cheer than Train and Sanders, but then my money has already gone for a copy of this ridiculous, overbearing, pretentious album, and maybe that's the idea, isn't it?
He was having his issues with the editors there at the Stone from day one, and it all boiled down to an MC5 review that I believe Elektra, who was MC5's label, bought a lot of stock in the early Stone for advertising, and they expected a stellar critique, a review. So they threw it to Lester, and of course Lester, being Lester, wasn't going to be bought. So he told him exactly what he thought of the groove. And it was on that, I understand, that Jan Wenner banned him from the pages of the Stone.
The set, recorded live, starts out with an introduction by John Sinclair, quote, Minister of Information for the White Panthers, if you can dig that.
When Lester rated it, when his staff rated it, it was a good, honest review. They pulled down the facades, they pulled out the slick advertising, and he boiled it down to why this music mattered.
Most of the songs are barely distinguishable from each other in their primitive two-chord structures. You've heard all this before from such notables as The Seeds, Blue Cheer, Question Mark and the Mysterians, and the Kingsmen.
The voice of Lester Bangs kept coming through loud and clear to us. Stick to what you are.
The difference, which will sell several 100,000 copies of this album, is in the hype, the thick overlay of teenage revolution and total energy thing which conceals these scrapyard vistas of cliches and ugly noise.
Lester and I had different tastes in music. He loved the Stones, he loved the Yardbirds. He kind of liked the Beatles, except he didn't seem to like Paul McCartney, and he thought Jeff Beck was the best guitarist he'd ever heard, and that totally changed his whole view of music. Before that, Lester had been into jazz. But then, like, say, the Yardbirds, Eric Clapton was in the Yardbirds. Well, Eric Clapton formed Creem. He hated Creem. Even though they were all monstrous virtuosos on their instruments, he couldn't stand that. And I thought, wait, this is just like John Coltrane, free jazz. He'll do 10-minute improvisations. This is what they're doing on Spoonful.
He was always at odds with Jan Wenner, the editor of Rolling Stone. I think they sort of tolerated Lester, but he would give bad reviews to bands that the Rolling Stone didn't want him to give bad reviews to. So he'd get into trouble. I think at one point Wenner fired him for being disrespectful to musicians.
So he liked more underground stuff. As soon as it went mainstream, he didn't usually like it, but yet we liked it. So he looked down on people that liked stuff that he used to like.
He called me and wanted to know if I wanted to go to State College and see a poet, and it turned out it was Allen Ginsberg, and he and I met Allen that time, and Les gave him a copy of Drug Punk, which was the book that Lester was working on about the times we had here in the Valley.
Avoiding the point, of avoiding the real conflict and grappling with the real problem, which is what the hell are we going to do musically now? Rock as theater is the same old music, the same old gunk dressed up in new clothes. With I saw Jethro Tull where they had one member of the band got in a bunny rabbit suit and hopped across the stage. The audience is there engaged. I felt real alienated watching this, because I just didn't, whatever that bunny rabbit and that boom, boom, Sturm und Drang that they were putting down there was supposed to represent, it didn't communicate to me.
What a lot of people don't realize is that such a tremendous stream of great writing was coming out of a little apartment on First Street in El Cajon.
Les would regularly, though, read new entries to this journal that he was actually keeping on us.
Lester Bangs, would have his typewriter, perched on he had a plank of wood that he would balance on his knees. Maybe a can of Budweiser on the right, just typing away these reviews day and night. And some just truly brilliant, inspired stuff, and it was just all rolling. Greg Shaw published some of his work in Who Put The Bomp, including the famous James Taylor Marked for Death piece on the Trogs, and he watched Lester work on many occasions, and he said Lester was the only writer from that time that he knew never ever used a thesaurus or a dictionary or anything like that. But he was never having to grasp for a word. With Lester, it was just an avalanche of words, and it was just really a matter of how he could control them. All the stuff that was published in Rolling Stone, all those reviews from '69 to '71, and some of the stuff from Who Put The Bomp, that was written right there in El Cajon at the apartment he shared with his mom.
He would find boxes of records waiting for him at the top of the stairs there at his apartment.
And the other thing, of course, Lester was a fiendish record collector, and all of a sudden, every day, free records were arriving. And back then, the record companies were just super generous about sending out tons of free vinyl to every rock writer and flying them places to review their bands.
And of course, we would spin records all afternoon there of the new stuff. And the stuff that he immediately took a dislike to and didn't want to reconsider, he either gave to me, or we would take him out to Wells Park and play this game we kind of devised called Make It or Break It. We would use them as Frisbees, then bring them back, and the records that would play, he would give them a second listen of serious consideration.
He was enthusiastic about music even then. I don't know whether music was just his big release. He found a key in music that released his joy. Other than that, I don't know what he could do. I know he worked at a shoe store, and he tried some jobs and tried doing some stuff, but man, I don't think he was into it.
I actually was fortunate enough to see him work, and I would go over. A lot of times he would be on the bed, sitting on the bed. He had a little piece of plywood that he would put not only the typewriter, but usually a can of beer. And he'd be laying there listening to the record and just reading it out on the type. I mean, it was just amazing how the guy worked. He'd stop and get up and he goes, "Raychek, what do you think of this?" And he'd read it to me, and I was a kid, what you're Lester Bangs. You want my opinion?
Maybe he was modeling himself on Kerouac and Burroughs, but he wasn't modeling himself on other rock writers. And that's what makes him unique. That's what puts him in a class of his own. Most of the writers, they were just sort of very academic or just very boring if you read their writing now, and they're also very conforming to the expectations of the record company, just towing the line. They had to give good reviews to the record labels that are buying the advertising and essentially paying the bills. Lester didn't care about that, and that's when he started to ruffle feathers at Rolling Stone. Lester was dismissed for being disrespectful to musicians, which of course he must have loved, because he didn't have any respect for musicians as musicians. He only had respect for people who were true, creative artists.
His rebellion keeps coming out because he wants the authentic, real deal that he was taught as the high schooler in El Cajon.
Lester liked bands that could be minimalist, and they weren't doing it for the sake of virtuosity. When the first Stooges album came out in '69, he was all over it because that had all the qualities that he liked with those garage bands. I think he describes the song 1969 as being like a couple of downed meteorites smashing together. And for Lester, that was like perfection.
He maintained that voice to the very end, established when he was a civics guy, and he took those principles and applied it to every piece he wrote down the road, no matter how straight or how gacked to the nines he was on whatever he was doing to adjust his thinking. It still had to get him in the gut, and it still had to ring true on some level. And that truth kept changing over the years.
Let's take Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Here is like musical sterility at its pinnacle. A band that has absolutely no soul. There's no feeling in the music. The objective is to play preset solos as fast as you possibly can, breakneck speed, and do it for about 5 hours.
You can see there Lester was transitioning from the San Francisco Rolling Stone mentality to like this new thing that was going on in Detroit with Creem magazine, where they were disrespectful of anything they thought was bogus. Very essential to Lester's makeup was the Velvet Underground, which obviously he related to because he was a big fan of all the beat poets and the beat writers, and the Velvet Underground were from that same sort of sphere where they were writing about the streets, they were writing about drugs and deviant sex and all the kinds of things that Burroughs was writing about in his books, but doing it on a rock and roll level with very minimalistic music and feedback and noise. That was everything Lester liked in one package, and I think that's why the Velvet Underground was maybe the ultimate Lester Bangs band.
1970, New Year's Eve, I spent getting drunk on beer watching TV at my girlfriend's parents' house, periodically ducking out to drive by the motel bungalow of some needle freak friends because I wanted to buy some heroin, which I had never tried. Finally, they were home and sold me some. Nothing happened except later I drank some country club malt liquor, went home and wrote a review for Rolling Stone, which never got printed, of a Bob Dylan bootleg. Next day I bragged to all my friends, "I wrote a record review on heroin last night."
As his biographer, 13 years after the publication of Let It Blurt, I still get emails from people from around the world who were affected by this man's writing. I teach now reviewing the arts at Columbia College Chicago. It's a course in criticism. What is criticism? I have the kids read The Critic as Artist by Oscar Wilde. I have them read H.L. Mencken. Criticism is at its core good writing. just like a novel, an essay, a memoir, a poem, a short story. It's a piece of writing. It's a piece of writing that should affect somebody emotionally as well as giving them ideas.
He loved something about rock that we all love, and he preached something about rock that many of us lost our way and forgot about, which is what makes rock and roll rock and roll. It's heart and soul. It's your heart, it's your soul, it's honest. And when it's got those qualities, it's great. It doesn't have to be overproduced, it doesn't have to be overwritten, it could be simple. The Ramones, it can be Iggy Pop, but if you feel the real person, you feel the real identity coming through, then you've got real rock and roll.
This is what all art is. It's something that affects you emotionally and makes you think. For the critic to be that person who facilitates the appreciation of art, as well as entertaining and stimulating thought while you read them, I think it's a great form of literature. And I think Lester Bangs lives on in the people who read him, his 2 published anthologies, the people who read my biography, the people who become intrigued after they see Almost Famous, Cameron Crowe's depiction of him. I think he lives on because he spoke to people in a voice that was unique. He had great ideas. Many people in the world of rock criticism like to say he was all about style. He wasn't really a deep thinker. No. I think he was a great stylist, an entertaining writer, somebody who made you laugh, somebody who made you angry, somebody who also made you think. The ideas being presented in such a colorful and often very funny way, it's easy to write them off as not being ideas at all. But this aesthetic of, for lack of a better word, if we want to call it authenticity, the idea that if you had a soul and a burning desire to say something, to express yourself, you didn't need technical training, you didn't need a huge record company, and you didn't need to be someone who looked beautiful, you didn't need any of that stuff, you just had to let it blurt.
I don't think Lester really knew what he wanted to do with his life, and you know, most teenagers don't. You know, and I think, but he knew he was good at writing, and I think he knew he wanted to write, and all of a sudden this, you know, he was getting paid for writing reviews in Rolling Stone, so he became a rock journalist. There wasn't really such a thing at that point, you know. There was rock fanzines, you know, just beginning, but to get paid to write about rock music was something that I think appealed to him, and then I think maybe he thought later on he would then start writing about some real subjects, but he kind of got on that train and was never able to get off. That's what it became to him, was just he wrote reviews of rock and roll records, and that's really what he did for his whole life.
1971, I stayed home and read the Bible. No, that's a lie. What I did do was go to the drive-in with my girlfriend, all hopped up, me that is, on vodka and her mother's thyroid pills, totally unable to concentrate on the double feature of I Drink Your Blood and I Eat Your Skin, thinking all night how next morning I was going to do like Jack Kerouac and just jump in my car eating speed with one hand while flicking the starter with the other, and drive till I plash through Blakey and breakers of light on the golden prows of the Rocky Mountain Shield. Of course I didn't. Woke up with a muzzy hangover instead, which is probably just as well. I could have ended up being John Denver.
In some ways, when reading Lester Bangs, it's impossible to pull the person away from the writing. And a lot of, I really believe that person, in many ways, that writer, we began to form here in El Cajon.
Creem was perhaps the most immature and the most radical in its approach to its irreverency. They did not treat it like there was a piety to it. They were the antithesis of that attitude.
The last time I saw and spoke with Lester was before he went to Creem magazine, before he moved out. I mean, we were in contact with a couple of letters, but he kind of distanced himself from the whole El Cajon thing. You know, he was pretty much done with El Cajon. Didn't want to come back and sell shoes in El Cajon.
I knew Lester when he started being published. I wasn't as close to him then as I was in my teens. I would even talk to him occasionally about something he wrote or some band. I mean, you know, when you talk to Lester, you can't talk about anything but music, really. I mean, it was a predominant thing. You would talk about music. It was the common bond. It was his definitely big job. It was his thing. It was his life. It was his joy.
Debbie and Lester had a little fling in '71, I believe it was. Les would come by and pick her up, and it came out later that he was actually driving my father's '58 Impala because it was a much bigger makeout car. The fling, as it was, didn't last all that long. It was a couple, 3 months, I think, is all.
He got that job at Creem magazine and left California for Detroit and really never looked back.
I talked to him a couple times when he was in Detroit at Creem, and he wrote me a couple times.
Andy visited Creem magazine at one point. They tried to maintain it via letters, but the crazy, drug-taking, communal ambience of the early Creem magazine, everybody first living on Cass Corridor and then in a house in rural Walled Lake, that didn't fit her style. And him being so fascinating, I mean, she certainly had a respect for music and art, but him being as obsessive as he was, it was over. And I think Lester was lonely for much of his time in Detroit. He'd had a circle of friends, and Andy was key, to be sure, but other friends like Rob Houghton and Roger Anderson who thought like he did. But in Detroit, he was alone. And I think when he expressed in letters from Detroit nostalgia for El Cajon, it was for those people.
A lot of times writing a review was just a platform for him to write about other things. And he would just go off on a million tangents. You know, he would just be talking about his life, about his thoughts, or relating these funny stories. Or just letting his imagination run wild. I mean, one of my very favorite pieces that he ever wrote, and one of his most famous is the Psychotic Reactions and Carburetor Dung, which gave the title to his anthology of his work. When he started writing about the Count Five, and they only had one album, but he imagined this entire discography where they had, I think, 5 albums. And he wrote a review for each one, including like quoting lyrics, imaginary song titles. I mean, the last album, I think it's called Snowflakes Falling on the International Dateline. You know, they're just these incredible titles, and the lyrics of the songs are just fantastic, and they're all from Lester's imagination. Since, Lester died, I think, there's sort of a lot of people that try to step up and write in that same style, and very few of them have come close. It just comes across as self-indulgent, and it doesn't seem real.
About the only places where I could foresee the emergence of a truly vital rock and roll band at present would be the most out-of-the-way places in America. So unless some rabid new Rat Pack combination of Question Mark and the Mysterians, the Trogs, the Stooges, MC5, and Bob Seger comes roaring out of some nowhere right-wing cowboy town, some real charmer of a town in Arizona where Alice Cooper was born and created, or maybe Idaho or Arkansas. I'd like to include New Mexico, but no, it'd be fruitless since the goddamn place is overrun by wandering hippies, turning it into a gigantic combination cowboy Haight-Ashbury and spiritual commune spa in the desert.
He was excited about the Stooges and things like that, and he noticed the Stooges, the MC5, a lot of this stuff was coming out of Detroit, as was a small magazine called Creem that also started publishing his reviews. So I think he increasingly saw that maybe the center of the rock and roll universe, at least as how he saw rock and roll, was certainly not in San Francisco, the home of the hippies, but Detroit, this sort of the Motor City, a Midwest industrial town where this sort of tough, unpretentious rock and roll was coming out of.
Other than that, the only real hope is Detroit, where the kids take a lot of downs and dig down bands. But at least there's no folky scene, and lots of people still take care about get down, gut bucket rock and roll passionately, because it takes the intolerableness of Detroit life and channels it into a form of strength and survival with humor and much of the energy claimed. People tend to have horse sense, which is refreshing, and know what's important. Even more than that, they know what's absolutely crucial and what's a gaudy ball of gauze.
I can't turn down. Don't try to make me turn down. down. Don't try to make me turn down. I don't know how to turn down. We only play round rocks. You can eat our socks, but we won't turn down. Yeah.
Al Cajon had a huge part in shaping who Lester was, of course, because he lived his entire adolescence there. And maybe Al Cajon wasn't that different from 1,000 other suburbs, certainly in Southern California. It was kind of nowheresville. But those are the places that always breed the best creativity.
For me, he's sort of this hero because his life kind of mirrors mine in some small ways.
Al Cajon, that small town mentality and the feeling of the need to want to escape and also to kick against it. I mean, the fact that he had the Jehovah's Witness background, I mean, that was obviously something that he kicked against.
The leader of the group is this fellow named Brian Ferry, who is possibly the most vacuous excuse for a superstar that has yet been presented to us. Now, like I became a big Roxy Music fan when they did Stranded, and after that it was my unfortunate experience to meet Mr. Ferry at a party where I want to go up and say, Brian Ferry, you're my hero, I love you, a great record. This man was so bland that he was standing there in this white tuxedo with a cigarette in his hand, not saying anything. Somebody should have shoved him in a corner, shoved the martini in his hand and forgotten about it.
He would come back for Christmas and spend the holidays with his family or his mother.
He wanted the experience of intellectual thought without having to tie himself down to somebody else's structure.
And then he did move to Detroit, and I did call him a couple times, and I wrote him a couple times, and we spoke. And I even asked him, hey, what's Detroit like? Can I move out there? Or, what's going on? And he said, oh man, don't come out here, this is dark.
We were just his pals, go hang out, listen to records together.
But after that, I saw him less and less.
We got to the point where we went back east, working with Creem magazine, and I didn't really see him too much after that.
1972. New Year's I spent dead drunk and gut pit depressed at my mother's house in California. Called up my friend Nick in NYC and miserably groaned through several leagues of whiskey. I think I'm becoming an alcoholic.
He came back to El Cajon a few times, and I remember after he had moved to Detroit, he came back, and I remember going to the store and getting some booze, and he got some Romular, and he was Lester still. Enthusiastic about music, sort of rambling, sort of taking all the conversation.
He kind of had a miserable childhood, really, with his father dying in a fire and the whole Jehovah's Witness thing that he rebelled against. I think part of Lester was always proud of being from a small little town like El Cajon, where he grew up. But I think a much bigger part of him was happy that he escaped this little box, the box of El Cajon.
He sent me subscriptions to Creem and some stuff in the mail. But then after that, I don't know, I guess he moved to New York.
I had a few students a few years ago who were writing about him, and they were inspired by him because for them, he was the coolest thing that ever came out of El Cajon. This all started, I think, about 5 years ago, and we all got on board fighting to get Lester Bangs a plaque on the Walk of Fame here at Grossmont College because he is, is in a creative writing program. He's one of the most exciting things that has come out of our program.
Yeah, he came back to visit, and he came over to we were playing at this place called, it was either the Palace or JJ's, and down there on Pacific Highway. It was a pretty happening place, 1,000-seater. Lester came back from back east, and he really enjoyed the Glory Band.
He died young at 33, but he's remembered to this day. The subtitle of this book was America's Greatest Rock Critic. Since the publication of my book, it's been published in the US, throughout the United Kingdom, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Japan. I get emails still 10 years, 13 years later, from people all over the world who say, I carried this review by Lester Bangs in my wallet since I was in college and I first read it. I just discovered these books, or I've reread this book, his anthology, every year of my life. People whose signature lines include quotes from this guy.
Back in California again, staying at my old girlfriend's deserted though furnished apartment, as, unbeknownst to Mom, she's off living with some 45-year-old businessman. So there I am enjoying her empty apartment, lying around listening to Raw Power in Berlin all the time, when I get this bright idea. I'll take all these sleaze rock LPs to this party and blast them.
We started the Lester Bangs Memorial Reading, and so every fall, usually in October, we do a reading in honor of Lester Bangs, and we start off with some kind of tribute to him where we'll read from his work, or we'll have someone talk about his style of writing, or historically his role in journalism and rock and roll. And then we will invite El Cajon writers, East County, San Diego County writers, up and coming to read their work. And so he's become at Grossmont, especially in our creative writing program, an icon, a hero for honest writing, truthful writing, and just great style. And we often teach him in our creative writing classes because we see him as sort of one of our own.
He wanted to be a non-member of everything, really, and that's how I do remember him. He was this goofy guy. He was this guy that you could see coming. If you had 10 people, he would be the one that looked a little different.
A lot of these guys that we all grew up together with were really influenced by Lester, and in his taste in music. We figured, well, if Lester likes it, it has to be good.
He was really kind of on his own road and didn't much care about trends.
Boy, you got to be in a certain mood to listen to much of the really out Coltrane free jazz, and Lester was always in that mood.
I was just very fortunate that one of my friends was Lester Bangs, because I learned an awful lot from him.
But he was a cool kid at that age. I just remember listening to him 90% of the time and talking 10% of the time.
Oscar Wilde wrote a famous essay called The Critic as Artist, and it argued in some ways that the critic was more important than the artist, that without someone to put this art in context, it might as well have never been created. I think he's someone who helped us fall in love and deeply understand, as we were feeling, the power of rock and roll. Understand it intellectually and feel it emotionally. And that's a gift that I think keeps on giving long after Lester's left us.
I was the last friend of his that he actually sought out the last time he was in San Diego. I saw him the night before he went back to New York. And a month, maybe 6 weeks later, he passed away.
He was a dedicated writer. He was right from the beginning. He wrote furiously. He wrote furiously in longhand and furiously on the typewriter. He was always generating page after page after page.
A bottle of soy and a hit of speed. I'm on the track now. That's all I need. For 8 hours, I'll be gone. Tomorrow morning, I'll be crawling home. Wrote me some lyrics for a new song. Gonna call my friends and we'll get it wrong. But that's good, 'cause wrong is right. Yeah, that's good, 'cause wrong is right. The dark ages gonna jam tonight. The dark ages gonna jam tonight. A little harp, a little slide. The dark ages gonna jam tonight. Well, yeah, now. And I hit a speed. jams and